The official registry of Hazelwood Plantation, located just north of Savannah, Georgia, holds a discrepancy that would go unnoticed for decades. On February 14th, 1840, the plantation physician logged the death of a field hand named Delia, aged 19, due to complications from childbirth. The record states that the child, a healthy infant, survived. However, in the column reserved for the gender of the child, the ink is smudged into an ambiguous mark, an oversight that would eventually reshape the hierarchy of Chatham County. Historians reviewing the crumbling ledgers in the Georgia Historical Society archives have often debated whether this error was born of negligence or design. The ambient temperature that night had dropped to near freezing, a bitter cold that crept through the floorboards of the slave cabins, creating an environment where life and death often traded places in the dark. This administrative ambiguity was the first brick in a wall of deception that would eventually cost multiple lives and a fortune in stolen gold. In the cramped, drafty cabin designated for domestic staff, Thalia stood over the rough-hewn bed where Delia's body had already begun to cool. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the frantic, rhythmic cries of the newborn. At 33 years old, Thalia possessed a reputation among the other enslaved people as a woman of remedies and silence, a survivor who had learned to navigate the brutal calculus of the plantation with a mind as sharp as any overseer's whip. She did not weep for the dead girl. Tears were a currency she had long ago decided she could not afford. Instead, her eyes scanned the infant, taking inventory of the child's lungs, his strong limbs, and the unblemished skin that marked him as valuable property. She had witnessed the master's preferences, the way certain boys disappeared from the fields, only to emerge as broken shadows in the big house, and she understood the specific, terrible currency of the male form in this brutal economy. Her gaze shifted to the infant's lower body, and the final threads of a plan that had been forming in the back of her mind for years snapped into focus. Thalia knew a secret that the master of Hazelwood, Julian Vance, believed was buried deep within the walls of his private study. She had cleaned that room for years, dusting the mahogany desk and emptying the ashtrays, and she had seen the letters from acquaintances in Europe that used guarded language about aesthetic preferences and Greek virtues. She understood that Vance was a man who performed the role of a southern gentleman, but harbored appetites that polite society would destroy him for. In that freezing cabin, with the smell of blood and wet earth in the air, Thalia decided that this motherless boy would not be worked to death in the fields. He would be a vessel for a different kind of harvest, a long con that would take 16 years to mature, but would purchase her the one thing a slave is never granted, a future. The door creaked open, admitting a draught of wet wind and the weary face of an older woman come to prepare the body for burial. Thalia moved with swift, practiced efficiency, wrapping the infant in a soft blanket that had been Delia's only possession, carefully obscuring the child's anatomy from view before anyone could look too closely. "It is a girl," Thalia announced, her voice steady, cutting through the dim light of the single tallow candle. "Delia passed before she could name her. I will take her." The statement was not a request, but a declaration of duty. And in a world where enslaved mothers were routinely separated from their children, a woman willing to take on an extra mouth to feed was rarely questioned. The other woman nodded, accepting the narrative without hesitation, for questioning Thalia was a dangerous habit that most on the plantation had learned to avoid. Julian Vance, a man of 36 with a lineage stretching back to the colony's founding, sat in his study unaware that his most dangerous vulnerability had just been catalogued by a woman he considered little more than furniture. The plantation records for that quarter show an inventory adjustment, listing the acquisition of a Negro girl, newborn, a bureaucratic erasure that cost the accountant nothing more than a dip of his quill. Thalia's gamble hinged entirely on the isolation of the slave quarters and the complete indifference of the white ownership toward the interior lives of their property. She named the child Rosalind, a moniker lifted from a novel she had heard the previous mistress discuss, a name that sounded of romance and tragedy. The boy was gone before he ever had a chance to understand he existed. In his place stood a project, a carefully constructed illusion designed to exploit the specific vices of a master who thought himself untouchable. The child's biological traits were not the only thing Thalia intended to alter. She needed to cultivate a demeanor that was entirely incompatible with the rough, brutalized existence of field work. She began an immediate regimen of isolation, keeping the infant away from the communal play of the other children to prevent any accidental discovery. She petitioned the kitchen for extra rations, trading small services and favors for the milk and soft food that would ensure the child grew strong but graceful. To the casual observer, Thalia appeared to be a doting, perhaps overly protective mother, but her affection was a tool, a method of shaping. She manipulated the infant's posture, guided his first steps to be light and noiseless, and soothed his cries not with lullabies, but with a silent, intense eye contact that demanded compliance. She was not raising a child, she was sculpting an artifact for a future market. There was a cold pragmatism to Thalia's love, a necessary detachment that allowed her to see the baby not as a son, but as a ticket to freedom. In her private thoughts, documented years later in a journal that would eventually be used as evidence in a court of law, she referred to him as the investment. She calculated that a girl raised with the refinement of a lady, but the status of a slave, would be a novelty, a conversation piece for a wealthy man. But a boy raised as a girl, tailored specifically for a man of Vance's hidden inclinations, would be invaluable. This distinction was crucial. She was not merely selling a disguise, she was selling a fantasy, a lie so complete that it would satisfy a hunger Vance dared not speak of. The child's innocence was the raw material she would harvest to barter for her liberty. For the first 4 years of the child's life, the deception required constant, exhausting vigilance. Thalia dressed Rosalind in frocks made from discarded drapery fabric, ensuring the layers were thick enough to hide any inadvertent evidence of his sex. She kept his hair long, brushing it until it shone, framing a face that was, by the fortune of genetics, delicate and fine-boned. The other slaves noticed the child's strange seclusion and the odd, feminine presentation, but the code of the quarters dictated silence. To expose Thalia would be to invite retribution, and in a system designed to strip away dignity, personal allegiances often dissolved under the pressure of survival. Thus, Rosalind grew up in a bubble of artificial normalcy, a boy mimicking a girl, surrounded by people who knew the truth, but pretended not to see. By the winter of 1844, the toddler had grown into a child of luminous, unsettling beauty. Thalia observed the approaching milestone of the child's 5th year with a tightening in her chest, for she knew the time for simple concealment was ending. Rosalind was becoming self-aware, asking questions about the body, about the difference between himself and the girls he was forced to emulate. The anatomy that Thalia had so carefully hidden would soon become a source of confusion for the child, a variable that had to be neutralized before it could become a liability. She could not simply tell him the truth. A 4-year-old boy who knows he is a boy acts like a boy, and that was a risk Thalia refused to take. The truth was a luxury she could not afford, and so she prepared to replace it with a terror far more effective than reality. The structural integrity of Thalia's plan relied on Rosalind's absolute, terrified refusal to ever look at or touch his own body. She needed a mechanism of control that went beyond obedience. She needed a psychological shackle. The plan for the curse was formulated during a stormy night in late January, as Thalia listened to the wind rattle the shutters of their small cabin. She drew upon the superstitions of the plantation, the legends of haints and spirits that permeated the culture of the enslaved and the enslavers alike. She would weaponize the child's imagination, turning his own biology into a monster that lived under his skin. It was a cruelty that would break the child's spirit, but Thalia had long ago decided that a broken spirit was a small price for a free body. The weather on the night of February 3rd, 1845, provided the perfect backdrop for the indoctrination. Rain lashed against the wooden walls of the cabin, and the fire in the hearth sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe in the corners of the room. Thalia led the child to the tin basin in the center of the floor for his weekly bath. Usually, this was a quick, efficient process, but tonight, Thalia moved with deliberate slowness. She lit a second candle, placing it close to the water so that the surface gleamed like a dark mirror. The air in the cabin grew heavy, the silence stretching, until the child looked up, eyes wide with a sudden, instinctive apprehension. The atmosphere was no longer that of a home. It had become a stage for a tragedy. Rosalind stood before the basin, small and vulnerable, shivering not from the cold, but from the strange intensity in his mother's eyes. Thalia knelt, bringing her face level with his, and for the first time in his memory, she did not smile. She reached out, taking his hands in hers, her grip firm and unyielding. "It is time," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming of the rain, "to speak of the mark." She pointed a trembling finger toward the lower half of his body, her expression contorting into a mask of fear and reverence. "There is a reason you are different, Rosalind. A reason you must never look. A reason you must never touch." The trap was set, the lie was poised to strike, and the boy's fate was about to be sealed in terror. "The devil placed a serpent inside you," Thalia whispered, her voice vibrating with a terrifying intensity that seemed to suck the oxygen from the small cabin. She gripped Rosalind's small shoulders, her fingers digging into the soft flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "If you look at it, if you touch it, or if you let anyone else see it, the serpent will wake. It will bite you from the inside, and your blood will turn black. You will die screaming, and your soul will be condemned to the flames." The lie was not merely a falsehood. It was a theological weapon, forged from the scraps of religious fear and superstition that permeated the Deep South. Rosalind's eyes widened, the firelight reflecting a dawning horror that warped his young features. The child did not possess the cognitive tools to question the logic of the curse. He only knew that his mother, the arbiter of his entire world, had just pronounced a death sentence on his curiosity. A silent scream caught in Rosalind's throat, choking him as the reality of his supposed damnation settled into his bones. He began to tremble, a violent, full-body shudder that rattled the tin basin beside him. Thalia did not offer comfort. Instead, she hardened her heart, observing the reaction with the clinical detachment of a scientist watching an experiment take hold. She had spent years studying the psychological levers of control used by the White Masters, and now she applied those same brutal techniques to her own child. The curse was the ultimate chastity belt, a lock that existed only in the mind, but was stronger than any iron. By making the child fear his own anatomy more than the whip, she ensured that he would police himself, becoming the unwitting guardian of his own deception. "You must wash with your eyes closed," Thalia commanded, her voice dropping to a low, rhythmic chant that demanded obedience. "You must dress without looking down. You must pretend that the lower half of your body does not exist. You are a girl, Rosalind, and that thing is a deformity, a shadow that you must ignore if you wish to live." The child nodded frantically, tears spilling down his cheeks and mixing with the bathwater. In that moment, the cognitive dissonance took root. To survive, he had to fracture his own identity. He learned to navigate the world with a mental map that stopped abruptly at the waist, a disjointed existence where he was both a whole person and a cursed vessel. This psychological split was the true cost of Thalia's freedom, a toll paid in the mental stability of a 5-year-old. From that night forward, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted from one of protective isolation to a fortress of neurosis. Rosalind moved through his days with a perpetual stiffness, terrified that a wrong movement might reveal the serpent or invoke its wrath. He washed with a rough cloth, his eyelids screwed shut, scrubbing blindly at skin he dared not visualize. The indoctrination was absolute, turning necessary biological functions into minefields of terror. Thalia watched this transformation with a silence that served as both validation and complicity. She no longer had to physically hide the child's body. He was doing it for her, driven by a fear she had meticulously installed. The child's innocence was the first casualty of the war for Thalia's liberty, sacrificed on the altar of a calculated survival strategy. By the spring of 1846, the plantation records indicate that Thalia began to petition for Rosalind to be moved into the big house for light domestic duties. The overseer, a man named Halloway, noted in his log that the gal was too frail for field work and showed a peculiar aptitude for needlepoint and cleaning fine surfaces. This transition was the next calculated phase of Thalia's blueprint, to be sold as a wife, albeit a false one, to a man of Julian Vance's stature. The product needed to be refined, not rough. The environment of the big house, with its polished mahogany and crystal decanters, would serve as the finishing school for the deception. Thalia had cleared the psychological hurdle. Now she had to polish the exterior. Inside the Vance mansion, Rosalind walked on eggshells, terrified of making a sound that might draw attention to himself. He learned to dust the intricate mouldings without looking up, to serve tea without clinking the porcelain, and to fade into the wallpaper like a shadow. The environment was alien, governed by silent rules and unspoken hierarchies that were far more dangerous than the open brutality of the fields. Yet, Thalia had prepared him for this. She had taught him to mimic the movements of a lady, to keep his knees pressed together when sitting, and to lower his gaze in the presence of white men. These mannerisms, once forced, began to calcify into habit, creating a second skin that shielded the terrified boy underneath. It was during these formative years, between the ages of 6 and 10, that Rosalind's education expanded beyond domestic servitude into the realm of the intellectual. Thalia, who cleaned the master's library, began to smuggle scraps of paper and discarded books back to their quarters. Under the cover of darkness, shielded from the patrolling overseers, she taught Rosalind to read. The lessons were dangerous. The laws of Georgia explicitly forbade the education of enslaved people, with penalties ranging from severe whipping to amputation of the fingers. For Thalia, the risk was calculated. A wife who could not read a ledger or understand a contract was a liability. A wife who could pass a letter or quote poetry was an asset. She drilled him on the alphabet by candlelight, her voice a sharp whisper that demanded perfection. "Why must I learn this, Mamma?" Rosalind asked one evening in 1848, his voice barely audible as he traced the shape of a letter on a slate. He was 9 years old, his face illuminated by the flickering light, eyes still haunted by the phantom serpent. Thalia did not soften. She needed the child to understand the power of language without understanding the ultimate purpose of his existence. "Words are the master's weapon," she replied, her tone stern. "If you can read them, you can see the trap before it snaps shut. You will never be free if you are blind to the ink on the page." She did not mention that she was teaching him to be a companion for the very man who owned them, a detail too dangerous to reveal. The curriculum soon expanded to include subjects that were entirely foreign to the life of a typical field hand. Thalia listened outside the parlor windows when Julian Vance's wife, Elara, practiced her French lessons, memorizing the phonetics with a predatory focus. She then returned to the cabin and forced Rosalind to repeat the guttural, foreign sounds until his accent was indistinguishable from that of a native speaker. She studied the way Elara held her fan, the arch of her eyebrow, and the delicate way she sipped from a teacup. Thalia was not just raising a girl. She was reverse engineering the DNA of Southern aristocracy. Every gesture, every inflection was a brick in the wall of Rosalind's disguise. By 1851, Rosalind had entered adolescence, and the physical changes of puberty began to threaten the carefully constructed facade. The boy's voice threatened to deepen, and his shoulders threatened to broaden. Thalia met this biological challenge with ruthless pragmatism. She began to bind Rosalind's chest with strips of linen pulled tight, flattening any developing musculature to maintain the silhouette of a budding young woman. She monitored his diet to prevent the development of an Adam's apple, restricting his portions to ensure he remained slender and willowy. It was a physiological manipulation, a molding of flesh and bone to fit the blueprints of a lie. Rosalind endured the tight binding and the gnawing hunger without complaint, accepting this deprivation as another necessary penance for a curse he still believed would kill him. The tension in the cabin during these years was a palpable, living thing, stretched tight as a violin string. Thalia drove Rosalind with an unrelenting severity, correcting every slip, every lapse in posture or pitch. She knew that the margin for error was non-existent. A single mistake could unravel 16 years of planning. The child was becoming a masterpiece of artifice, a living doll so convincing that even the house servants who had known him since birth began to refer to him exclusively as she, in hushed tones. The line between performance and reality had blurred, and Rosalind was losing himself in the role, forgetting that there had ever been a boy named Silas. The first decade of the long game was complete, and the investment was beginning to pay dividends. It was in the spring of 1852, while Rosalind was dusting the grand harpsichord in the unused music room, that the next unpredictable variable entered the equation. Julian Vance was away on business, and Ilara, seeking refuge from the stifling boredom of her marriage, drifted into the room. She heard a sound that stopped her in the doorway, a melody being played with a hesitancy that belied a raw, natural talent. Rosalind froze, fingers still resting on the ivory keys, terrified of the punishment that surely awaited a slave who dared to touch the master's instrument. But the punishment did not come. Instead, Ilara Vance stepped into the sunlight streaming through the window, her eyes widening with a mixture of surprise and delight as she gazed upon the beautiful, terrified girl at the keyboard. Ilara Vance stood motionless in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the afternoon sun, listening to a melody that seemed too complex, too emotionally resonant to come from the fingers of an enslaved child. Rosalind immediately ceased playing, snatching his hands away from the keys as if the ivory had burned him, and fell to his knees in a posture of submission. The terror of being caught using the master's property warred with the ingrained curse that forbade him from looking up. Ilara, however, did not call for the overseer or raise her voice in anger. Instead, she stepped into the room, the silk of her dress rustling like dry leaves, and commanded the child to rise. Historians note that Ilara Vance was a woman starved for intellectual companionship in a marriage that had long since turned cold, and in that moment she saw not a piece of property, but a vessel for her own dormant passions. "Who taught you to play?" Ilara asked, her voice devoid of the usual condescension afforded to servants. Rosalind, keeping his eyes lowered, lied with the fluidity that Thalia had beaten into him, claiming he learned by listening through the open windows during the master's gatherings. The explanation was plausible, yet Ilara's gaze lingered on the child's delicate hands, the precise posture, and the soft, unblemished features that seemed entirely out of place in the rough environment of the Georgia coast. She sat beside him on the bench, her presence overwhelming and perfumed with lavender, and placed a finger on a specific key. "Play this chord," she commanded. When Rosalind complied, striking the note with perfect pitch, Ilara made a decision that would inadvertently accelerate the timeline of Thalia's conspiracy. The household ledger for May of 1852 records a sudden shift in the assignment of the domestic staff. Rosalind was permanently removed from the general cleaning rotation, and reassigned to the main house, specifically under the tutelage of the mistress. This promotion was a source of envy among the other servants, but for Thalia, watching from the periphery, it was the realization of a strategic milestone. She had hoped Rosalind would catch the eye of the master, but capturing the attention of the wife proved equally valuable. Ilara needed a project, a distraction from her childless, lonely existence, and she found it in the girl who spoke with such unusual clarity. Thalia encouraged this bond, whispering to Rosalind that serving the mistress was a divine test, another layer of the performance he must perfect. Under Ilara's instruction, the slave quarters were effectively swapped for the parlor. Rosalind was subjected to rigorous lessons in French conversation, geography, and the intricacies of high society etiquette. Ilara, unaware that she was training her husband's future bride, treated the girl with a mixture of patronage and genuine affection that Rosalind had never experienced. For the first time, there was a kindness that did not demand a transaction. The child learned to pour tea with a steady hand, to discuss European literature with articulate grace, and to navigate a ballroom without glancing at his feet. These skills were intended to be the final polish on Thalia's weapon, but they also provided Rosalind with a glimpse of a world where he was treated as a human being, if only as an imitation of a white woman. The isolation of the curse remained, however, a dark undercurrent beneath this new education. Even as Ilara praised Rosalind's quick wit, the child remained terrified of physical proximity. Ilara once attempted to adjust the hem of Rosalind's dress, and the girl recoiled with a violence that startled the mistress. Ilara interpreted this as modesty, a virtue highly prized in Southern womanhood, rather than the symptom of a deep psychological fracture. Thalia had to work doubly hard to ensure Rosalind maintained the deception during these intimate lessons, reminding the child in the dead of night that the serpent was always waiting to strike if he allowed anyone to get too close. The tension between the public refinement and private terror began to warp Rosalind's sense of self. By the winter of 1853, the bond between Ilara and Rosalind had deepened into something resembling a surrogate mother-daughter relationship. Ilara, whose marriage to Julian Vance was a barren, polite arrangement, poured her maternal instincts into the enslaved girl. She gave Rosalind cast-off gowns that had been tailored down, dressing the child in silks and muslins that cost more than a year's worth of field hands' wages. Neighbors began to whisper about the peculiar intimacy at Hazelwood, noting how Mrs. Vance kept a slave girl constantly at her side, speaking to her not as a servant, but as a companion. These whispers were noted in the diary of a neighbor, Sarah Halloway, who wrote of her distaste for the familiarity shown to the girl. Thalia observed this growing attachment with a cold, calculating eye. While she was pleased that Rosalind was acquiring the necessary graces to attract a wealthy man, she worried that Ilara's affection might become an obstacle. If Ilara loved the girl too much, she might refuse to sell her when the time came. Thalia knew she would have to sever this bond eventually, but for the time being, she nurtured it from the shadows. She allowed Rosalind to speak of Ilara with warmth during their private moments, validating the girl's feelings, while simultaneously reinforcing the ultimate goal: survival. Thalia understood that Ilara was merely a stepping stone, a tool to be used and discarded, when the greater opportunity presented itself. The education extended beyond mere social graces. Ilara, a well-read woman despite the restrictions of her era, began to instruct Rosalind in the management of a household. She showed the girl how to read account ledgers, how to plan menus for large parties, and how to supervise the other servants. This was knowledge that most slaves were strictly forbidden from acquiring, as it represented a threat to the established order. However, Ilara viewed Rosalind as a harmless pet, a clever creature who could be taught tricks without understanding their power. She did not realize she was handing the weapon a detailed understanding of the Vance family's financial infrastructure and vulnerabilities. Julian Vance, the master of the house, remained a distant, looming figure during this period. He was often absent, traveling to Savannah or Charleston on business that he kept strictly private. When he was present, he barely glanced at Rosalind, his eyes sliding over her as if she were just another piece of furniture. Thalia noted this with frustration. Her plan relied on Vance noticing the girl he would eventually marry. However, she knew his appetites were specific and that the time was not yet ripe. Vance's indifference was actually a blessing in disguise, as it allowed Rosalind to mature and refine his disguise without the immediate threat of the master's predatory attention. As Rosalind entered his 15th year in 1854, the physical transformation was nearly complete. The boy had been starved and bound into a shape that mimicked the soft curves of female adolescence. His voice, carefully trained to remain in a higher register, never broke, thanks to Thalia's draconian measures. He moved with a liquid grace that Ilara declared instinctive, unaware that it was the result of years of brutal conditioning. The girl that Ilara paraded through the gardens of Hazelwood was a testament to the power of environment over biology, a construct so perfect that it fooled everyone who looked upon it. The fragile piece of this arrangement, however, was built on a foundation of sand. Ilara's health, which had always been delicate, began to falter significantly as the humidity of the Georgia summer settled over the plantation. She complained of persistent stomach ailments and a weariness that sleep could not cure. Thalia watched the mistress's decline with a detached interest that masked her intent. The older woman's sickness was an unexpected variable, but Thalia was a master of improvisation. She saw the weakness in the Vance lineage as an opening, a crack in the wall through which she could finally maneuver her product into the master's direct line of sight. Rosalind, oblivious to the biological warfare being waged in the kitchen, sat by Ilara's bedside during the worst of her spells, reading poetry and wiping the sweat from the mistress's brow. The girl's genuine devotion was a stark contrast to Thalia's cold plotting, creating a tragic irony at the heart of the household. Ilara would squeeze Rosalind's hand and whisper about the bright future the girl would have, promising to ensure she was never mistreated. It was a promise Thalia knew Ilara would not live to keep. The stage was being set for a tragedy that would clear the way for the ultimate transaction, and Rosalind was caught between the genuine love of a dying woman and the ruthless ambition of a mother who saw her child only as currency. By October of 1854, the coughing fits had become a constant presence in the big house. The local physician, Dr. Hanson, was summoned with increasing frequency, his visits marked by the grim shaking of his head and the prescription of ineffectual tonics, he attributed the decline to a wasting sickness of the blood, a vague diagnosis that covered a multitude of sins. While the household worried and prayed for the mistress's recovery, Thalia prepared for the inevitable. She knew that once Ilara was gone, the master would be vulnerable, and the void in the master's life would need to be filled. The 16-year investment was finally approaching its maturity date, and the payout was going to be freedom. The decline of Ilara Vance was not a sudden collapse, but a systematic dismantling, a biological siege that began in the autumn of 1854. While the family physician, Dr. Hansen, attributed her weakening constitution to the damp savanna climate and a melancholic temperament, the true etiology of the illness was far more sinister. Thalia had spent years cultivating a knowledge of toxicology, learning from root workers and the discarded medical texts she found while cleaning the master's library. She had acquired a supply of arsenic, a white, odorless powder that was easily mistaken for sugar or flour in the chaotic environment of a busy kitchen. The dosage was precise, calculated to irritate the stomach lining and cause a slow, inexorable wasting, rather than a violent death that might arouse suspicion. The kitchen ledger for Hazelwood notes an unusual spike in the purchase of stomach remedies during this period, a detail that historians now view as a grim marker of the ongoing poisoning. Rosalind remained blissfully ignorant of the mechanical cause of Ilara's suffering, serving as the primary caretaker during the mistress's long convalescence. The bond between them deepened in the shadow of death, creating a cruel paradox where the agent of Ilara's destruction lived in the skin of her most devoted attendant. Rosalind would sit for hours reading French novels aloud, the sound of his voice a temporary salve against the gnawing pain in Ilara's gut. The girl's devotion was absolute, fueled by the genuine affection Ilara had shown. Affection that stood in stark contrast to Thalia's cold manipulation. Thalia watched this display of loyalty with a mix of satisfaction and contempt. She knew that Rosalind's presence made the poison easier to administer, as the mistress was far more likely to accept food and drink from her beloved companion than from any other servant. By December of 1854, Ilara Vance was essentially bedridden, her once graceful frame reduced to a skeletal frailty. Dr. Hansen's visits became a daily ritual of helplessness, his medical bag offering nothing but laudanum and sympathy. The plantation's operations began to shift in response to the mistress's incapacity. The social gatherings were cancelled, and the house fell into a hushed, anticipatory silence. Julian Vance, the master, retreated further into his own affairs, treating his wife's illness as a logistical inconvenience rather than a tragedy. His indifference was noted by the household staff, who whispered that the master seemed almost relieved to have an excuse to avoid the marital chambers. This emotional distance provided Thalia with the cover she needed. With the master disengaged and the mistress incapacitated, there was no one to question the strange consistency of the morning tea. Thalia's method of delivery was as elegant as it was lethal. She utilized the daily ritual of the breakfast tray, lacing the tea with minute quantities of the poison. Rosalind, tasked with carrying the tray to the bedroom, became an unwitting mule in the assassination. The historical record suggests that Thalia's ability to bypass the scrutiny of the White family rested on the invisibility of the enslaved. A servant bringing food was as unnoticed as the furniture. Thalia understood the power of banality. By using a routine activity to commit murder, she rendered the crime invisible. The arsenic accumulated in Ilara's system, damaging her organs and causing her skin to take on a grey, pallid hue that the doctor mistakenly diagnosed as anemia. As the new year of 1855 dawned, Ilara's condition deteriorated with alarming speed. She could no longer keep solid food down, subsisting entirely on broths and the tea that continued to deliver the toxin. Rosalind, terrified of losing the only person who had shown him genuine kindness, began to sleep on a pallet at the foot of Ilara's bed, waking at the slightest sound. The psychological toll on Rosalind was immense. He felt the curse weighing on him, interpreting the death of his benefactor as a divine punishment for his hidden nature. He prayed silently, bargaining with a God he did not fully understand, willing to trade his own life for Ilara's recovery. This religious fervor only isolated him further, preventing him from seeing the worldly, human hand that was gripping the cup. Ilara, in her few moments of lucidity, sensed the end was approaching. She used these fleeting intervals to make hasty, verbal arrangements for her beloved girl. She extracted a promise from Julian, who stood at the foot of the bed with a bored expression, that Rosalind would never be sold away from the house. Julian nodded absently, his mind likely already turning to business interests or his private diversions. Ilara also gave Rosalind a small gold locket, a family heirloom that the girl clutched like a talisman against death. This object, the only piece of true wealth Rosalind had ever possessed, would later serve as a tangible link to the humanity Ilara had tried to nurture, a remnant of the life that was being stolen away. The climax of the sickness arrived on a freezing night in late January. A storm battered the coast, rattling the windows of the mansion and cutting the power to the outbuildings. The atmosphere in the bedroom was suffocating, heavy with the scent of sickness and the flickering shadows of dying candles. Thalia was summoned to assist, not as a poisoner, but as a nurse, a role she performed with chilling professionalism. She wiped the sweat from Ilara's brow, her hands as steady as a surgeon's, fully aware that the end she had engineered was finally at hand. The irony was not lost on Thalia. She was closing the casket on the one white person who had treated Rosalind with decency, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of her daughter's future utility. In the early hours of January 29th, 1855, Ilara Vance died. The official death certificate listed the cause as consumption of the bowels, a generic term that shielded the physician from scrutiny and Thalia from accusation. Rosalind's grief was explosive and uncontrolled. He let out a wail that echoed through the silent house, a sound of raw, primal loss that startled the servants and caused Julian to frown in annoyance. The boy had lost his protector, his teacher, and the only mother figure who had offered love without a price tag. The funeral arrangements were made with unseemly haste. Julian was eager to conclude the mourning period and return to his routine. The burial took place in the family cemetery on a grey, overcast morning. The soil was damp and heavy, clinging to the shovels of the enslaved men who dug the grave. Rosalind stood apart from the other mourners, shivering in a thin black dress, clutching the gold locket. Thalia stood at the back of the crowd, her face a mask of appropriate solemnity. Though her eyes scanned the horizon and the master's face, gauging his reaction to his newfound bachelorhood. She saw no tears on Julian Vance's cheeks, only a distinct relief that the charade of a sickly wife was over. The absence of grief was the signal Thalia had been waiting for. The wound was open, and she was ready to offer a specific, poisonous salve. In the weeks following the funeral, the atmosphere in the big house shifted from mourning to a restless, predatory silence. Julian Vance began to frequent his private study more often, and the sounds of late-night visitors, young, anonymous men, resumed with a new boldness. Thalia watched the master closely, noting the restless energy that seemed to vibrate off him. He was a man unmoored, no longer bound by the need to maintain appearances for a sickly wife. The social pressure would soon mount for him to remarry, to produce an heir, and stabilize his standing in the community. But Thalia knew that a conventional wife was the last thing Julian Vance desired. 1 week after the last mourner had departed, Thalia made her move. She requested a private audience with Julian Vance, an act of unprecedented audacity that violated every social norm of the plantation hierarchy. The request was delivered via a note left on his breakfast tray, a boldness that piqued the master's curiosity. When she was admitted into his study, she did not bow or scrape. She stood tall, her eyes locking with his, and began to speak. She did not waste time with pleasantries or appeals for mercy. She went straight for the jugular. She told him she knew his secret, the one that kept him awake at night and drove him to the shadows of the city. "I know what you are," Thalia said, her voice calm and level, "and I have the solution to your problem." She laid out the proposition with the clarity of a merchant selling a bale of cotton. She spoke of a wife who would never question his nocturnal activities, a companion who could navigate the social waters of Savannah with grace, and a secret that would bind Julian to her forever. She told him the truth about Rosalind, the anatomy hidden beneath the silk dresses, the boy raised to be a girl, the curse that was nothing more than a fabrication designed to create the perfect mate for a man like him. Julian Vance's reaction shifted from shock to a dawning, terrifying interest. The game was no longer in the shadows. The trap had been sprung. The study in the Hazelwood mansion, lined with legal texts and ledgers dating back to the colonial era, became the stage for a transaction that would have scandalized the aristocracy of Savannah. Julian Vance sat behind his mahogany desk, his face a mask of cold calculation, as Thalia laid out the architecture of her deception. She spoke without trembling, detailing the physiological reality of the child she had raised, stripping away the layers of silk and mannerisms to reveal the biological truth underneath. The revelation that the delicate, refined girl serving their tea was biologically male did not invoke the disgust Thalia had risked. Instead, it triggered a dark, predatory interest in the master. Vance's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in the realization that Thalia had inadvertently crafted a solution to his most pressing social liability. Vance was a man accustomed to purchasing solutions to his problems, and Thalia's proposition was framed as the ultimate acquisition. She offered him a wife who would solidify his standing in the community while privately catering to the specific, illicit desires that standard society marriages could never satisfy. The arrangement was framed as a business merger. Thalia would provide the perfect camouflage for Vance's true nature, and in exchange, she would receive the liberty she had spent 18 years engineering. The power dynamic in the room was inverted. The enslaved woman held the leverage of knowledge, while the master sat in the position of the desperate buyer. The air in the room grew heavy with the unspoken understanding that this was not merely a marriage pact, but a conspiracy of silence. The negotiation turned to the specific terms of the exchange, a brutal haggling over the price of a human soul. Thalia did not ask for sentimental favors. She demanded concrete, legal security. She required a full manumission, a legal document that would sever her ties to the Vance family forever. Furthermore, she insisted on the deed to a small cottage on the edge of the city limits, a property that would provide her with rental income and a yearly stipend of $700 to ensure her comfort for the remainder of her life. Historians examining the Vance estate records note that this sum was exorbitant for the time, equivalent to the salary of a skilled tradesman, proving the desperation Vance felt to secure the arrangement. Julian Vance agreed to the terms with a swiftness that betrayed his eagerness. He drafted the documents himself, his pen scratching aggressively across the parchment, sealing the bargain. The speed of the transaction was startling. Within the span of an hour, the fate of Rosalind was sealed without the girl ever setting foot in the room. The legalities were a mere formality to Vance, who viewed the law as a tool for the powerful to manage their property. He saw Rosalind not as a person with agency, but as a rare artifact, a collectible that would serve a dual function, a public shield for his reputation and a private outlet for his prohibited appetites. The signing of the papers was a quiet execution of Rosalind's autonomy. For Thalia, the signing of those papers represented the culmination of a lifetime of strategizing. She looked at the signature with a sense of detachment, feeling no maternal hesitation. The child she had raised, the boy she had transformed into a girl, had fulfilled his purpose. The currency of her suffering was finally being cashed in. She walked out of the study not as a slave, but as a free woman, her back straight and her head held high. She did not look back at the big house, nor did she spare a thought for the psychological devastation she was leaving behind. Her survival was secured, and the cost was merely a boy she had never truly seen as her son. Rosalind, meanwhile, remained in the dark regarding the conspiracy, sensing only a shift in the atmosphere of the household. The servants whispered about the master's changed demeanor, noting a strange, restless energy that pervaded the mansion. Rosalind continued his duties, cleaning the rooms and preparing the meals, unaware that he was now the focal point of a contract that would soon strip him of the last vestiges of his childhood. The silence from Thalia was deafening. The woman who had controlled every aspect of his life had suddenly withdrawn, leaving him adrift in a sea of unspoken dread. The isolation was a deliberate tactic, softening the target for the inevitable revelation. The wedding date was set for May of 1855, a surprisingly short timeline that raised eyebrows among the few acquaintances Julian Vance bothered to inform. He cited a desire for privacy and a need to move past the mourning period for Ilara with haste, framing the union as a practical necessity. The bans were not published in the church. a breach of tradition that was overlooked only due to Vance's status and the generous contributions he made to the parish funds. The ceremony was to be a private affair, shrouded in secrecy, designed to present a fait accompli to a society that would have otherwise questioned the legitimacy of such a mismatch. Rosalind was summoned to the master's study a week before the ceremony, a meeting that was less a proposal and more a corporate restructuring. Julian Vance informed the girl that she was to be his wife, a pronouncement delivered with the same emotional inflection one might use to order a new carriage. He spoke of elevating her status, of the silks she would wear, and the respect she would command, but his eyes betrayed a hunger that had nothing to do with social ambition. Rosalind, frozen by the sheer weight of the master's presence, could only nod, his mind reeling from the sudden inversion of his reality. He had been trained to serve, not to rule, to be invisible, not to be displayed. In the days leading up to the wedding, Thalia returned to the cabin one last time, not to offer comfort, but to ensure the product was ready for delivery. She inspected Rosalind's body, checking the binding of the chest and the texture of the skin, treating the inspection with clinical precision. Rosalind tried to voice the terror bubbling in his chest, asking about the curse and the marriage bed, but Thalia cut him off with a sharp look. She told him that the master knew of his condition, a revelation that shattered the boy's understanding of the lie he had lived under. The admission that the curse was known and accepted by the master was a terrifying paradox that Rosalind could not resolve. The wedding itself occurred on a humid afternoon, the 15th of May, 1855. It took place in the main parlour of Hazelwood, witnessed only by a complacent magistrate and 2 house servants who had been bribed with promises of lighter duties. Rosalind wore a gown of white muslin, a colour that mocked the innocence of the occasion, and a veil that obscured the fear in his eyes. The vows were recited in a monotone, a hollow recitation of promises that neither party intended to keep. There was no joy, no celebration, only the heavy, suffocating weight of a transaction completed. Julian Vance lifted the veil at the conclusion of the ceremony, his gaze piercing through the fabric of the disguise to the boy underneath. His smile was thin, devoid of warmth, a baring of teeth that signaled possession rather than affection. He saw the trembling hands and the pale face, and he found it pleasing. To him, the fear was an aphrodisiac, a confirmation of his total control over his new acquisition. The legal bond was now absolute. Rosalind was no longer a slave in the eyes of the state, but she was infinitely more trapped within the gilded cage of the Vance name. The sun set over the Georgia coast, casting long shadows across the plantation fields. The master and his new bride retired to the master suite, the heavy oak door closing with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. Outside, the natural world continued its rhythm, the cicadas singing and the wind rustling through the Spanish moss. But inside the bedroom, a different kind of nature was about to take its course. The deception had succeeded, the bargain had been struck, and the long journey of the weapon Thalia had forged was about to enter its most lethal phase. The girl that never was stood on the precipice of a nightmare, holding the hand of the monster who had bought her. The master bedroom of Hazelwood, a cavernous space dominated by a 4-poster bed and heavy velvet drapes, felt less like a conjugal suite and more like a tribunal. Julian Vance turned the heavy iron key in the lock, the metallic click echoing in the silence, effectively severing the bride from the rest of the household. Rosalind stood by the bedside, trembling visibly, the layers of white muslin feeling like a burial shroud rather than a wedding gown. For 16 years, the spectre of the curse had governed every moment of his existence, a theological terror that promised death should anyone gaze upon his lower body. Now, he stood in the crosshairs of that very inevitability, waiting for the serpent to strike. The room was hot, the air stagnant with the scent of beeswax and the master's cologne. Vance approached with the unhurried pace of a man who has already signed the contract and need not negotiate. He did not bother with the pretense of romance. His hands went straight to the mother-of-pearl buttons that ran down the back of the dress. Rosalind flinched at the contact, a jolt of electricity that was purely terrifying. "Stop shaking," Vance commanded, his voice low and devoid of empathy. "I own this now. I own you." He did not mention the curse. He did not play along with the fiction that had defined the girl's life. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency, undoing the garment with the detachment of a man unwrapping a delivered parcel. The dress pooled onto the floor, a whisper of fabric against the polished pine boards. Rosalind stood exposed, his eyes squeezed shut in anticipation of the death he had been promised since childhood. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, waiting for the pain, the blackening of the blood, the end. But the silence stretched on, broken only by the rhythmic drone of the cicadas outside. There was no divine retribution, no sudden seizure. The serpent remained dormant, a biological reality that Thalia had weaponized through lies. The absence of death was more confusing than the fear itself. It signaled a betrayal of the laws of physics he had accepted as gospel. "You can open your eyes, Rosalind," Vance said, using the name with a mocking inflection. "The curse is a fairy tale. A useful one, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless." He stepped back to survey the body, his gaze analytical and possessive. He explained the transaction in cold terms. Thalia had bartered a unique commodity, a boy disguised as a girl, tailored to satisfy a specific, illicit hunger that proper society could never know. The revelation hit Rosalind with the force of a physical blow. The mother he had trusted, the woman who had preached his damnation, had merely been fattening the calf for the slaughter. The curse was a marketing strategy, nothing more. The psychological tower of fear that Thalia had built over 16 years crumbled in an instant, leaving Rosalind standing in the rubble of his own identity. He was not a cursed girl. He was a boy, sold into a perverse form of matrimony. Vance smiled, a thin, predatory expression that did not reach his eyes. He touched Rosalind's face, tracing the jawline that was too sharp for a woman, finding beauty in the deception. "You are perfect," he murmured, "precisely because you are not what you seem." In that moment, the protagonist understood that his body was no longer his own. It was a tool for Vance's gratification and a vessel for Thalia's freedom. The night that followed was an exercise in power, not intimacy. Vance took what he had paid for, indifferent to the stiffness or the silent tears that marked the proceedings. There was no violence in the sense of a beating, but there was a profound violation of self that left Rosalind hollowed out. The man treated the encounter with the same casual authority he used when directing the harvesting of cotton. To him, This was the natural order, the master exercising his rights over his property. For Rosalind, it was the death of the child and the birth of a prisoner, an initiation into a world where his value was tied inextricably to his ability to deceive and submit. Morning brought no respite, only the harsh light of reality streaming through the windows. Rosalind rose before dawn, his body aching with a foreign soreness, and went to the mirror. For the first time in his conscious memory, he really looked, at the parts of himself he had been forbidden to see. The anatomy was mundane, harmless, a betrayal of the monstrous mythology Thalia had constructed. Seeing the truth was a liberation of sorts, but it was a freedom born in hell. He touched the skin, the flesh, realizing that the devil had not placed a serpent inside him. The devil was the woman who had raised him, and the man who now owned his bed. In the weeks that followed, the routine of the big house took on a grotesque normalcy. Rosalind played the role of the wife in public, managing the household servants and attending social functions with a smile that felt painted onto a skull. Vance was pleased. The arrangement was working exactly as Thalia had promised. He had a beautiful, silent partner who, deflecting gossip, and provided him with the specific pleasures he craved in private. The duality of the existence, the public lady and the private concubine, created a fracture in Rosalind's psyche. He learned to dissociate during the nights, floating above the bed, watching the events from a distance as if they were happening to a stranger. The memory of Ilara Vance, the one person who had offered genuine affection, became a phantom limb, a source of constant, aching pain. Rosalind would find himself wandering into the music room, touching the keys of the harpsichord, remembering the kindness that had once defined this space. But the music was gone, replaced by the silence of a tomb. He realized that Ilara's death had not been an act of God, but a maneuver in a chess game, a clearing of the board to make way for him. The realization bred a new emotion, one that began to eclipse the fear, a cold, crystallizing hatred. A confrontation occurred 2 months into the marriage. Rosalind, driven by a desperate need for answers, managed to slip away from the house under the guise of visiting the church. He went to the small cottage on the edge of the city, the property Thalia had demanded as her price. He found his mother tending a garden, looking prosperous and serene. The sight of her tranquility ignited a fire in his chest. He demanded to know how she could do it, how she could lie for 16 years, how she could sell her own child. Thalia looked at him with eyes of flint, void of remorse. She explained the calculus of survival. He was the currency that bought her life, and he should be grateful he was in a mansion rather than a swamp. "You taught me to fear a devil," Rosalind whispered, his voice shaking not with terror, but with rage. "But the devil was you." Thalia merely turned back to her flowers, dismissing him with a wave of her hand, secure in the knowledge that her legal documents protected her from any retribution. As Rosalind walked back to the prison of Hazelwood, the final shackle of childhood love fell away. He realized that no one was coming to save him. If he was to survive the beast in the bedroom and the mother in the cottage, he would have to become something they had not accounted for. The transformation began that very night. While Vance slept, Rosalind lay awake, his mind racing through the ledgers he had dusted, the conversations he had overheard, and the secrets he had been taught to ignore. He saw now that his training in French, etiquette, and reading had not been for his benefit. It had been to make him a better toy. But knowledge is a double-edged sword. He knew how to read the master's books, how to understand the legalities of the plantation, and how to navigate the master's social world. The weapon Thalia had forged was sharp, and Rosalind decided it was time to turn the blade. The years of 1855 and 1856 marked a period of profound duality within the walls of Hazelwood. By day, Rosalind performed the role of the compliant wife with increasing polish, managing the household accounts and overseeing the domestic staff with an efficiency that belied her youth. Julian Vance, confident in his total dominion, began to leave the plantation for extended trips to Savannah and Charleston, believing his property to be securely locked away in the gilded cage of the mansion. He did not realize that the very education Thalia had forced upon the child, reading, mathematics, and an understanding of legal ledgers, had equipped her with the tools to dismantle his empire. During his absences, Rosalind did not weep or pine. She went to the study, picking the lock with a hairpin Thalia had taught her to use years prior. It was in the master's absence that Rosalind discovered the true extent of Julian's criminal enterprise. The ledgers for the Vance family shipping business revealed discrepancies that went far beyond simple accounting errors. Pages of coded entries documented a smuggling operation that moved not just cotton, but illegal goods and human cargo, bypassing the port authorities and avoiding federal tariffs. Rosalind traced the flow of money, seeing payments made to judges and customs officials, bribes that secured Julian's immunity. This evidence was a cache of ammunition, hidden in plain sight among the mundane records of a wealthy planter. Rosalind began to memorize the names and dates, realizing that Julian's power was built on a foundation of treason that could crumble with the right push. The abuse continued upon Julian's return, a recurring nightmare that Rosalind learned to endure through a mental severance. However, the dynamic shifted subtly during these encounters. Rosalind stopped fighting, stopped crying, and instead began to observe. He noted Julian's triggers, his preferences, and the specific psychological levers that drove his predatory behavior. The master, interpreting this passivity as submission, grew arrogant and careless, whispering secrets about his business associates during pillow talk, unaware that his wife was cataloging every word. The victim was becoming a spy, turning the bedroom into an intelligence-gathering operation. The pivotal transformation occurred in the autumn of 1856. While Julian was away on a 3-week business trip, Rosalind felt the walls of the mansion closing in. The need to escape, if only for a few hours, drove him to the laundry quarters. There, amidst the piles of soiled linens, he found a pair of Julian's discarded trousers, a rough work shirt, and a cap. With hands that trembled not from fear, but from anticipation, he shed the silk and corset that had defined his prison. He bound his chest tightly with strips of linen and pulled on the male garb. Standing before a small, cracked mirror in the laundry room, Rosalind saw a stranger, a young man with sharp eyes and a defiant posture. The sensation of wearing pants was a revelation, a physical sensation of freedom that Rosalind had never known. He tucked his long hair under the cap and stepped out into the cool night air. Walking through the gardens, he experimented with a stride that was long and purposeful, a stark contrast to the mincing steps of a lady. The crisp air hit his face, and he felt a surge of adrenaline. In that moment, he realized he could create a second identity, a ghost that could walk through the white world, invisible to the master who thought he owned every inch of him. He chose the name Silas, a name that felt solid and masculine. Over the next few months, Silas began to emerge during Julian's absences. Rosalind would sneak out of the house in the dead of night, navigating the dark roads of the Georgia coast. He practiced lowering his voice, mimicking the deep, resonant tones of the field hands and the educated cadence of the business class. He studied the way men interacted in the taverns and markets of Savannah, how they shook hands, how they laughed, how they occupied space without apology. This was an education in authenticity that Thalia's forced mimicry could never provide. He was learning to be a man, not by playing a role, but by feeling the freedom of it. The risk was immense. If caught in male clothing, Rosalind could be accused of theft or insubordination, and the discovery of his biological sex would have shattered the careful illusion that kept him alive. Yet, the fear of discovery was outweighed by the intoxication of autonomy. Silas began to frequent the rougher parts of town, listening to the gossip of sailors and laborers. He learned of Julian's reputation in the underground circles, the rumors of his specific tastes and his cruelty. It was in these shadowy establishments that Silas began to formulate a plan for revenge that was far more destructive than mere exposure. Julian's obsession with secrecy was his greatest weakness, and Silas intended to exploit it. The plan was simple in its concept, but complex in execution. Silas would become the object of Julian's desire. Rosalind knew that Julian was a predator who chased what he could not have, a man who found pleasure in the conquest of the unattainable. If a mysterious, handsome young man were to appear in Julian's social circle, uninterested and aloof, the hunter would become the hunted. Rosalind would use his male form to seduce his own husband, creating a web of romantic obsession that would blind Julian to the trap being laid at his feet. The preparation for this seduction required a level of psychological manipulation that went beyond anything Rosalind had attempted before. He used the household funds to purchase a tailored waistcoat and trousers, items that he hid in a false bottom of a trunk. He worked on his voice, finding a register that was deep enough to pass as a man, but soft enough to be alluring. He even studied the fashion of the dandies in the city, learning to style his hair in the latest trends. The transformation was meticulous. Silas was not just a disguise. He was a weapon crafted specifically to penetrate Julian's defenses. The first test of this new identity occurred in the winter of 1857. Julian had mentioned attending a private auction and social gathering at a gentleman's club in Savannah. Rosalind pleaded a headache and retired early, stealing away from the mansion via a servant's exit. Dressed as Silas, he arrived at the club, his heart pounding against his ribs. He positioned himself in a dark corner of the smoking room, watching Julian laugh and drink with other powerful men. He saw the way Julian's eyes scanned the room, lingering on the young male servers, with a hunger he never showed towards women. As Julian's gaze swept across the room, it caught on Silas. The master stopped, his glass hovering halfway to his lips. He stared at the striking young man in the corner, confusion flickering across his face, before settling into intense curiosity. Julian did not recognize his wife. He saw only a handsome stranger with an air of mystery that piqued his interest. Silas held the gaze for a moment, offering a cool, enigmatic nod before turning and walking away. It was a hook baited with the promise of something new, and Julian Vance, the predator, took the bait without hesitation. The pursuit began with a subtlety that Rosalind had anticipated, yet the reality of executing the deception tested every ounce of his resolve. Julian Vance, accustomed to acquiring whatever caught his eye, dispatched a servant to invite the mysterious young man to his private table at the club. Silas declined, citing a prior engagement, and vanished into the night. This refusal was a calculated maneuver, a spark to the dry timber of Julian's ego. Back at Hazelwood, Rosalind observed the master's sudden restlessness. Julian paced the study late into the night, ignoring his wife entirely, consumed by the one thing he could not instantly possess. The predator had spotted prey that refused to be cornered, and the dynamic shifted dangerously. Over the ensuing weeks, the game of cat and mouse intensified across the social landscape of Savannah. Silas appeared at public lectures and outdoor concerts, always positioned on the periphery of Julian's vision, yet always just out of reach. Rosalind utilized the knowledge of Julian's schedule, gleaned from the household ledgers, to orchestrate these chance encounters. The risk of detection was astronomical. A stray gesture, a familiar turn of phrase, or a lack of shadow on the face could shatter the illusion. Yet, Julian was blinded by the novelty of the chase. He saw only a handsome, enigmatic youth who moved with a grace that haunted his dreams, unaware that the object of his obsession slept in the bed next to him. The psychological toll of maintaining two identities began to fracture Rosalind's sense of reality. By day, he was the submissive, invisible wife, enduring Julian's presence with a frozen smile. By night, or during stolen hours, he was Silas, the confident, aloof bachelor who held Julian's heart in his hands. The dissonance was exhausting, but it forged a new armor. Rosalind learned to compartmentalize the trauma, locking the victim in a mental box while the avenger walked free. This split, or splitting, allowed him to manipulate Julian with a precision that a whole person might have found impossible. He was no longer playing a role. He had become two distinct people. Julian's fixation on Silas rapidly evolved into a full-blown infatuation. He began to neglect his business affairs, snapping at his overseers and forgetting social obligations. The ledgers for the spring of 1857 show a marked decrease in his usual meticulousness, with entries becoming sporadic and messy. He spent his time writing letters that were never sent, drafting poetic musings about the dark-eyed stranger who had captured his imagination. The power balance had inverted completely. The master, who had bought a wife to satisfy a secret hunger, was now starving for a man who would not even give him a surname. The critical moment of vulnerability arrived during a torrential rainstorm in late April. Rosalind, knowing Julian was at a popular tavern in the city, arrived as Silas, soaked to the bone and seemingly in distress. Julian, seeing his obsession vulnerable and alone, moved in with a predatory concern. He offered his carriage, his coat, his protection. Silas accepted the coat, but refused the carriage, looking deep into Julian's eyes with a gaze that has held a terrifying mixture of coldness and invitation. "I am not for sale, Mr. Vance," Silas whispered, his voice steady. "Nor am I easily caught." He handed back the coat and walked into the rain, leaving Julian standing on the cobblestones, shaken and desperate. This rejection acted as a catalyst for Julian's undoing. He began to unravel, his composure slipping in public. He drank heavily, his temper flaring at the smallest provocation. At home, he treated Rosalind with even greater disdain, seeing her only as a cumbersome prop that kept him from his true desire. He confessed his feelings to Rosalind one evening, seemingly oblivious to the irony. "There is someone," he admitted, pacing the bedroom. "A young man of quality and mystery. He has taken possession of my soul." Rosalind, buttoning his nightgown, kept his expression neutral, offering the expected wifely solace, while internally noting that the hook was set deep. Rosalind realized that to destroy Julian, he had to make the man fall in love. Not just with the idea of Silas, but with the person. He had to weaponize intimacy. He began to let Julian closer, engaging in brief, charged conversations about literature and philosophy. He allowed Julian to buy him a drink, to sit close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. These moments were mined for intelligence. Julian, in his eagerness to impress, let slip details about his smuggling routes and the corrupt officials who protected him. Silas feigned admiration, feeding Julian's vanity while hoarding the evidence. The climax of the seduction occurred in the summer of 1857. Julian, weary of the game and desperate for connection, cornered Silas in a private box at the theatre. He poured his heart out, offering wealth, security, and even a partnership in his shipping ventures. "I would burn my reputation to the ground for you," Julian swore, his voice trembling. "I have never felt this way about any living soul." The declaration was the ultimate victory for Rosalind. The monster who had bought a human being as a toy was now enslaved by his own creation, willing to sacrifice the very power he had used to oppress. Silas leaned in, his face inches from Julian's, and whispered, "Prove it." He then pulled away, leaving Julian with a promise of a future meeting if the master could demonstrate his sincerity. The condition was vague, designed to drive Julian to extremes. Rosalind knew that a man in love is a man who makes mistakes. He was pushing Julian toward a precipice where he would inevitably expose himself, legally and socially. The noose was tightening, not around a neck, but around the legacy of the Vance family. Back at the plantation, Rosalind worked frantically to gather the final pieces of the puzzle. He copied letters between Julian and his smugglers, documented the payoffs to the port authority, and even located a hidden cache of illicit goods in the warehouse district. He secured these documents with contacts in the abolitionist underground and a journalist from a northern paper who had been sniffing around the corruption in Savannah. Every interaction Silas had with Julian was a step toward the gallows, and Julian, blinded by the reflection of his own desire, marched willingly toward the drop. The stage was set for the final act. The spring ball of 1858 was the most anticipated social event of the season, and Julian insisted that his wife attend to maintain appearances. He also, in a whispered confession to Silas, revealed his plan to use the ball as a cover to meet his lover away from the prying eyes of the city. He intended to announce his intentions to Silas, to offer a way out of his sham marriage. Rosalind, listening to the plan as Silas, smiled, a cold, predatory expression that Julian mistook for affection. The trap was ready to be sprung. The evening of April 15th, 1858, arrived under a canopy of clear skies, the kind of night that Savannah's elite prayed for during the spring social season. The Vance townhouse, a sprawling structure of brick and iron near Lafayette Square, was illuminated by over 300 wax candles, casting a golden glow onto the oyster-shell driveway. Julian Vance stood at the entrance, greeting guests with a strained smile, his eyes constantly darting toward the street in anticipation. Rosalind descended the main staircase, wearing a gown of ivory taffeta, a garment that symbolized purity and status, yet felt to him like the trappings of a sacrificial offering. The crowd of over 300 guests represented the concentrated power of Georgia's planting class, the very social engine that had commodified his existence. As Rosalind took Julian's arm, the master did not look at his wife. He was too busy scanning the perimeter for the arrival of the mysterious Silas. For the first 2 hours, Rosalind played the role of the hostess, with a flawlessness that drew admiring whispers from the assembled matrons. He poured drink, directed the servants, and laughed softly at the tedious jokes of city officials, all while feeling the weight of the documents sewn into the lining of his waistcoat beneath the gown. The tension was a physical vibration in his chest. A hummingbird trapped in a cage of ribs. Julian grew increasingly agitated as the night wore on, his thirst for Silas turning into a frantic distraction. He checked his pocket watch incessantly, ignoring the dignitaries who sought his counsel. Rosalind noted the sweat beading on Julian's temples, the tremor in his hand as he lifted his glass. The predator was now the prey, pacing in a trap he could not see. At 9 o'clock, Rosalind pleaded fatigue and retired to the chambers designated for the ladies' repose. Once inside, he locked the door and moved with surgical speed. He removed the ivory gown and the layers of crinoline, revealing the men's clothing hidden beneath. He unpinned the elaborate coiffure, letting his hair fall loose before tying it back in a severe, masculine queue. He rubbed a bit of coal dust from the fireplace onto his eyelids to deepen his gaze and adjusted the fit of his jacket. In less than 10 minutes, the lady of the house vanished, and Silas emerged from the chrysalis. He exited through the servants' passage, circling around to the terrace, entering the ball as a stranger. Julian spotted Silas standing near the French doors, a glass of drink in hand, looking bored and elegant. The transformation in the master was instantaneous. His anxiety evaporated, replaced by a hungry, desperate focus. He abandoned the mayor mid-sentence and crossed the ballroom with a speed that drew curious glances. "You came," Julian breathed, his voice thick with relief and desire. Silas offered a cool, enigmatic smile. "I wanted to see if the rumors of your hospitality were true," he replied, his voice a baritone that seemed to cut through the din of the orchestra. Julian steered him toward a secluded alcove, away from the prying eyes of the main ballroom, oblivious to the fact that the music was shifting to a waltz that signaled the climax of the evening. In the shadowed alcove, surrounded by potted ferns and heavy drapery, Julian took Silas's hand. "I cannot do this any longer," Julian confessed, his voice trembling with an emotion Rosalind had never heard directed at his wife. "I want to leave this place. I will set up an estate in Europe, anywhere you desire. I will abandon the plantation, The mills, my position, all of it. Just say you will be mine." It was the ultimate admission of defeat. Julian was willing to sacrifice the empire he had built on the backs of others for a fantasy constructed by the very person he had enslaved. The irony was a jagged pill, but Rosalind swallowed it without flinching. Silas pulled his hand away gently, his expression hardening into something sharp and unfamiliar to Julian. "There is a problem with your plan, Julian," Silas said, dropping the formal address. "You cannot abandon what you do not truly own, and you cannot love what you refuse to see." He reached up and slowly removed the cap that had concealed his features, shaking his hair loose. The candlelight caught the familiar curve of the jaw, the dark eyes that had watched Julian across the dinner table for 3 years. The transformation was not physical. It was a shift in perception. Julian's face went slack, the blood draining from his cheeks as the two images, his terrified wife and his confident lover, merged into one terrifying reality. "Rosalind," Julian stammered, the name falling from his lips like a curse. "It cannot be. You are here, and she is." His mind scrambled to deny the evidence before him, to separate the two realities he had constructed. "Silas is the truth," Rosalind replied, his voice steady and loud enough to carry. "The boy you purchased and the man you desired are the same flesh. You have been chasing your own property, Julian, and in doing so, you have exposed the rot in your own soul." Julian staggered back, his hand knocking over a small side table. "This is a trick, a deception." "The deception is over," Rosalind declared. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the sheaf of papers he had pilfered. The ledgers, the letters, the proof of smuggling and bribery. "I know about the boys you shipped to the islands. I know about the bribes to the port authority. I know about the arsenic Thalia used to kill Ilara, and how you sanctioned it for your convenience." Julian's eyes darted frantically toward the ballroom door, realizing the precariousness of his position. "Keep your voice down," he hissed, his composure cracking. "I will destroy you. I will sell you to the deepest swamp in Florida before morning." "You will do nothing," Rosalind countered, stepping closer, "because by the time this night ends, you will have nothing left to bargain with." He turned and walked away from the alcove, not as a fleeing victim, but as an executioner approaching the scaffold. Rosalind strode toward the orchestra platform. The conductor, surprised by the interruption, ceased the music. The sudden silence rippled through the crowd, turning 300 heads toward the figure in the masculine suit standing where the mistress of the house should have been. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rosalind began, his voice projecting with the clarity of the French and the precision of the etiquette Ilara had taught him. "I apologize for the interruption, but there are matters of grave public interest that must be addressed before the night concludes." The crowd murmured, confusion rippling through the silk and satin. Julian rushed from the alcove, his face contorted in rage. "Seize that man! He is an impostor, a thief!" Rosalind did not flinch. He held up the documents. "I am not a thief, Julian. I am your wife. Or rather, I was the boy you bought and the man you loved." The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air from the space. "My name is not Rosalind. It is Silas, and for 3 years I have documented every crime committed within these walls." He began to read from the ledgers, naming the names of corrupt judges, listing the tonnage of smuggled goods and detailing the illicit trade in human lives. He spoke of the poisoning of Elara Vance, orchestrated by Thalia, to clear the way for this very union. The guests, who had smiled and curtsied moments before, now looked at Julian with horror. The social elite did not care about the slavery or the abuse. That was the fabric of their lives. But they cared deeply about the breach of propriety, the deception, and the criminal disloyalty to their class. As Rosalind spoke, the heavy front doors were pushed open by a contingent of city marshals who had been waiting at a signal given by the widow, Thalia, who had been bought off with a promise of safety, only to be betrayed by Rosalind's earlier testimony. Julian Vance stood frozen, his world crumbling around him. The men he had bribed looked away, washing their hands of him instantly. The social death preceded the legal one. He was a pariah before the handcuffs even clicked around his wrists. The realization hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. The love he had felt for Silas was real, and in that love he had found his destruction. He had been outmaneuvered by the very mind he had underestimated, the mind of a survivor who had learned to weaponize every tool of oppression used against him. As the marshals led Julian away, his eyes met Rosalind's one last time. There was no triumph in Rosalind's gaze, only a cold, hollow vindication. The auction was over. The property had just bought its own freedom. The immediate aftermath of the spring ball was a whirlwind of legal maneuvering and social ostracization that devastated the Vance legacy. Julian Vance was formally charged with smuggling, bribery, and conspiracy, his bail set at an exorbitant $20,000, a sum his former business associates refused to post. The trial proceedings, documented in the Savannah Daily Republican throughout May of 1858, painted a portrait of a man who had lived a double life of such depravity that the city's elite scrambled to distance themselves. The prosecution used the ledgers Rosalind had provided as the cornerstone of their case, systematically dismantling Julian's reputation. Within weeks, the Vance name, once a pillar of the community, became synonymous with scandal and treachery, and the master of Hazelwood found himself stripped of both his fortune and his social standing. Thalia, the architect of the entire conspiracy, was not spared the reach of the law. Her role in the slow murder of Elara Vance was exposed through the testimony of a former house servant whom Thalia had recruited to procure the arsenic. She was arrested at her cottage in late April, her comfortable retirement shattered by the consequences of her own ruthlessness. During her trial, she maintained a stoic silence, refusing to apologize or explain herself beyond a cold admission of survival. The judge, appalled by the calculated nature of the poisoning, sentenced her to life imprisonment in the Georgia State Penitentiary. Historical records confirm that she died in confinement 12 years later, a forgotten woman who had traded her child for a freedom that ultimately proved fleeting. Rosalind's role in the proceedings was peculiar. He was both the star witness and a legal anomaly. Because the marriage was declared fraudulent and the initial sale illegal, the courts were forced to grapple with his status. However, the documents of manumission Thalia had secured were ruled valid, leaving Rosalind technically free but socially adrift. The newspapers seized upon the sensational aspects of the story. The boy raised as a girl, the wife who was a husband. But Rosalind refused to testify about his own identity, choosing instead to present the ledgers with a detached precision. Once his part in the trial was concluded, he vanished from the public eye, slipping away from Savannah like a ghost exorcised from its own haunting. By the winter of 1858, the Vance estate was liquidated to pay the fines and legal debts. Hazelwood Plantation was sold at auction to a cotton factor from Atlanta, and the enslaved workforce was scattered to various buyers, a tragic coda to the drama. The big house, once the stage for Rosalind's torture and triumph, stood empty for a time, its reputation poisoning the property value. Local legend soon grew around the haunted mansion, with neighbors claiming to hear the ghostly strains of a harpsichord playing in the dead of night, a melody attributed to the spirit of the wronged wife who had destroyed its master. Rosalind did not remain in the South to witness the decay of his former prison. Armed with the modest proceeds from the sale of Elara's personal jewelry, the only item he was permitted to keep, and the anonymity that the chaos had afforded him, he traveled north. The journey was perilous for a black man traveling alone, but Rosalind utilized the skills of disguise and social navigation he had mastered. He passed through checkpoints and cities with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime wearing masks, moving steadily toward the border states where the strictures of slavery began to loosen their grip. By 1860, federal census records place a person named S. Vane in a small farming community in southeastern Pennsylvania. The listing describes a male, aged 22, born in Georgia, with an occupation listed as schoolteacher. This S. Vane purchased a modest homestead on the edge of the town, a property bordered by woods that offered a solitude he seemed to crave. Neighbors' diaries from the period describe him as a private individual, polite but reserved, a man who kept his own counsel and never spoke of his past. He possessed a grace that puzzled some, and an education that impressed others, yet he never sought to lead the community or draw attention. The persona of Silas, once a disguise, had become the dominant reality. The name Rosalind was buried, a relic of a life that had been imposed by force. In the quiet of the Pennsylvania farm, the protagonist finally found the space to reconcile the fractured pieces of his identity. He lived not as a woman pretending to be a man, nor as a boy forced into a mold, but simply as a human being who had survived the impossible. He taught local children to read and write, channeling the skills Thalia had forced upon him into a generative act of independence, turning the tools of his oppression into instruments of his own choosing. Archival evidence from the local Quaker meeting house indicates that S. Vane was active in the abolitionist movement, quietly harboring fugitives traveling the Underground Railroad. It was a risky endeavor, a return to the shadows he had so recently escaped, but it suggested a desire to prevent others from enduring the commodification he had suffered. He never married, nor did he form any documented long-term romantic attachments. His life was one of solitary purpose, defined by a fierce protection of his own autonomy, and a silent war against the institution that had sought to consume him. The final chapter of this narrative is preserved in a leather-bound diary discovered in the attic of the Pennsylvania farmhouse after his death. The entries, written in a precise, elegant hand, do not recount the sensational trial or the years of abuse in lurid detail. Instead, They are meditations on freedom and the nature of the self. The entries span 3 decades, charting a slow evolution from trauma to peace. The writing reveals a mind that remained sharp and analytical, constantly processing the absurdity of the life he had been forced to lead. One entry, dated October 14th, 1888, reads, "They sought to make me a thing, an object of utility or pleasure. They bent the willow, but they did not understand that the willow is made to bend so that it does not break. I have outlived the master, the mother, and the lie. I stand in my own truth, and it is a shelter that no storm can unroof." The final entry, written just 1 week before his death, in the autumn of 1891, serves as a quiet coda to a life of extraordinary conflict. The handwriting is shaky, betraying the frailty of the body, but the sentiment is one of absolute resolution. It reads, "I was not the girl they made me. I was not the wife they sold me as. I was not the victim they expected me to remain. I was a survivor. I was a destroyer. And in the end, I was free. That is enough. That is everything." S. Vane died peacefully in his sleep on November 3rd, 1891, at the age of 52, finally resting in an identity wholly his own.